Okay, so welcome to episode one of the Complex Systems podcast. So, with us, we've got the Multiverse School crew who are learning a lot about complex systems dynamics. We've been reading the book Complex Adaptive Systems Computational Models for Complex Social Worlds. And so we've read through part one, and we're going to discuss that today, along with some of the concepts around game theory. Well, we've been reading Stanford's course, their open source course on game theory and rational agents, which then, complex adaptive systems modeling builds off of. So, to kind of kick us off, why don't we just go and have somebody define what we mean by what is an agent?
I think it's an individual unit in a more complex system that is like making decisions or yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then when we say rational, what do we really mean by rational? Agents make rational choices.
Based on the information that they have available to them, the optimal choice based on that information.
Yeah, exactly. We don't mean that they're perfectly geniuses. We don't mean that every agent always makes the perfect best choice. We just mean generally they do make decisions based on the information they have available to them. Okay, and so when we say games or game theory, anyone have a good definition of a game? When we talk about games and game theory.
I think from my intuition and from working with games would be a lot of times having to do with rules or rule sets, sometimes having to do with competition or non-competition with each other, but often have to do with like strategies and like multiple agents in interaction with each other, usually using strategies.
Cool, yeah. And utility. When we talk about utility in a game, what do we mean?
So in the context of games, usually the utility would reflect an agent's like the how much an agent would want to do something based off of the certain circumstances. Some of the systems that use in utility AI will have to do with considerations and actions and how much a certain action should be weighted based off of the situation.
Exactly. Yeah. The concept of utility is really, really common in game theory, and it's used to represent, in abstract, the score of the game, right? And so, for example, in the prisoner's dilemma, utility is how many years you get to stay out of prison, right? And so it can kind of represent anything. It can represent money, it can represent energy, it can represent social influence, right? So utility is a abstract notion of taking how useful something is, an action, and turning it into a number that we can then rank actions by. So we can say that this action's 50 good and this action only 20 good, So, yeah, that's what we mean by those things. All right. So, we're talking about game theory. We've got agents, the players in the game, and the games. When we say a game, we mean any kind of agent interaction where there's sort of a final outcome, right? Or there's a score in play. There's some way for us to rank where are the agents in this game. So, game theory is the formal study of strategies, right? If we employ strategy A, we get utility amount 1. If we employ strategy B, we get utility amount 2. If these two agents employ strategy B, the only possible outcome is outcome C, where we get some other value of utility, right? Payoff to the agents. And it's also the formal study of why things happen when nobody intended for them to happen, right? For example, the prisoner's dilemma. Everyone always brings up the prisoner's dilemma in game theory, and it's, if you just don't confess, if you both don't confess, you both go free or you both get the minimum sentence. But if one of you turns, the other one gets the maximum sentence, and so both of you tend to turn and you get like a really unoptimal outcome, right? And everyone always thinks, well, I would just not confess, you see. That's how you beat it. But the problem is, no one gets to coordinate, and you don't know if the other person is going to confess. You really don't. And do you want to gamble? And so the prisoner's dilemma is used to, like, say, well, if you're smart, or if you're coordinated, or if you agree, somehow you can defeat it. But the most rational choice in that situation, when you haven't had a chance to coordinate, is to, of course, cooperate so that you spend the minimum number of years. And so the outcome that nobody intended was that you both confess, even when you have both agreed not to. So, there's always this temptation to kind of paint these actors as, well, can't you see the grid? Isn't the strategy obvious? Right? But when we look at these strategies at a high level, they're obvious, but they're not the most rational choice for that individual actor, and so its outcomes intended by no one. So, we've discussed in the past together the concept of feedback in a system. And so we had an example of the bees, right? Anyone recently read that story? Want to kind of tell the bee story? Go ahead.
There were actually like a few different elements discussed, like a few different stories, sub-stories about it. One of them was keeping the hive cooled off, or keep it from overheating, but not being too cold. And if you have bees acting, so basically they spread apart and flap their wings to cool off the hive when it gets too hot, and they clump together when it gets too cold. But if you have a homogeneous population, you end up with like an undesirable effect, because genetically diverse bees get hot at different temperatures. So you end up overshooting, like it'll get too hot, too cold, too hot, too cold, and you'll never quite come to an equilibrium, because the bees, just can't coordinate, and, you don't want a single type of bee. Otherwise, it doesn't math.
Yeah, exactly. It's hard to. You couldn't really coordinate bees, right? Like, that's the thing about the beehive, is that they're not actually coordinating at a high level. There's no like master bee planner that tells the bees, okay, well, you go out into this meadow, and then you're gonna scout over there, right? Like, the bees all individually decide, okay, well, it's a bit hot in the hive, and I know I'm supposed to go get honey right around now, so I'm gonna do that, and they just go out and they just sense flowers, right? So that emergent coordination comes from just the structure of the hive, right? There's no bee thermostat where there's like a signal. The signal is feeling of hot, receiving the signal that I am at this temperature and that's too hot for me. So yeah, these are elements of feedback, and feedback in a system can be disastrous for equilibrium, right? Too much feedback in a system and we get a runaway effect of some sort. You've heard this with a microphone. You get a microphone turned up too loud, and then the speaker's too loud, and it starts to squeak, right? And that's because the microphone's hearing the speaker, it's playing it back at a slightly higher pitch over and over again very quickly. And so that high pitch is a runaway effect, right? A feedback in a system. If we have all bees at the same rate, we overshoot too fast, right? And then there's, sometimes you want a cascade to happen, but you don't want the cascade to happen on a hair trigger, right? So there's that other example of the bees. Anybody want to tell the second bee story?
On the flip, like if you were to have a fully homogenous population in terms of like defending the hive, it could technically be good because if there's a threat, everybody could go towards it, but it would just be inefficient. So you would want to like, I think the end of that story started opening like the dialogue for a more like decentralized organization where like there will be sentries that aren't really designated as sentries, but they'll start throwing up like the flag and being like, hey, it looks a little suspicious over here. And if it is a real threat, then the cascade increases until it becomes like that kind of avalanche and it's like full mounted attack or just subsides.
Yeah, exactly. But you want a really narrow range on sentry bees. You don't want hair trigger bees to be out, just seeing one angry bee, I'm freaking out, and thus freaking out the whole hive. We don't want a, boy who cried wolf bee situation, right? That's literally the story, the boy who cried wolf. It's the causing the village to cascade over nothing is like, it's a problem, right? It's an energy drain. So it's not just about lying. It's like inaccurate signals will upset the hive, right? So yeah, a lot of systems are about maintaining homeostasis. They're about maintaining equilibrium amongst a few different dynamics, hot and cold, amount of threat for the bees. But then we get into the more complicated social world modeling, right? And so this is where we get into democracy. And we see some interesting things in the Tybau model. And so that's the in the beginning we talk or sorry in the beginning of that section we talk about a very simple world of two towns, that one that serves green chili and one that serves red chili, right? And so who wants to discuss that element? Let's talk about it.
So I guess the two towns, there were, in each town, there's a majority and a minority, two who like the red and one who likes the green, and that's true for both towns. And it's inoptimal for the person who likes the green chilies. But if one of the people who likes green chilies moves to the other town, then you're left with a situation where one town has equal amounts of people who like the chili, either side of chili, and then the other town is just happy because they have everybody liking the same kind of chili, and that's what we get.
Yeah, exactly. And so we get into this dynamic of sorting, right? So decentralized control in a complex adaptive social system you can't really just have somebody telling everyone what to do and then that stuff happens. It's too complicated for that, right? We're all individual agents, and our society is similar in structure to an ant colony or a beehive. There may be some important people without which that part of society won't function, but it's made up out of the individual actions of all of the little agents that make up the beehive or the ant colony. We're ants or bees in this situation, right? So we've got democracy and the choice, but we also have this concept that we can sort ourselves, right? We can move to a different town. And so that's when things get a little bit more complicated, right? So we deal with some of the minority dynamics there. Being in the minority, if you're always in the minority in every town, then you never get your favored chili. And this is a way to take the actual political like stuff out of the model. We just have a choice, and it relates to your happiness, and therefore our happiness is the utility function in this complex adaptive system, right? The utility of any given like policy choice enacting strategy is a certain level of happiness, right? We call it the social welfare score. And so in our most simplified model, we just have the one choice and the two towns. And the minority never gets it their way until there is noise introduced to the system, until sorting begins, until we have a minority town and then we have a majority town, so that all red chili loving people are in one town and all green chili people loving green Yeah, green chili people are in another town. And so, like, this is a very, you start to get into some dangerous ideas here. You're like, uh-oh, well, what's this pointing at, right? What direction do we want to go here? Like, is it better to just sort everyone into their respective favored towns and then we just leave it at that? It kind of leads you there, right? But then you start to immediately have problems once you introduce any amount of complexity into, like, there's more than two towns, and maybe people have more than one position on things in their lives. So, yeah, Rowan, you want to talk about?
Yeah, I was just gonna say I kind of struggled to like divorce myself from the political context, and I was a bit like, oh, like, oh, if you don't like it, you can just go to another town. And then I was like thinking about the authors, like politics and motivations and stuff, and I was like really struggling to like just be like, no, it's a model about chili. But I kept being like, huh, what does this mean? And I was like, why can't they serve two chilies? Why can't they have both chilies at the annual lunch or whatever it was?
Yeah, and it's hard to write a book about, I think, complex adaptive systems where we talk about stuff like democratic referendum without upsetting someone. And so we're like, what's the least controversial thing that you could use? Chili choice. So Rio, what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I thought it started to get more interesting when they brought up like, okay, so now there are 10 choices, it's like, so I'm just imagining, okay, what kind of chili do you like? Okay, what kind of ice cream do you like? What kind of soda do you like? And then you start to have to make a decision about, well, which town is optimal for me. And then like you said, democratic referendums start to kind of like that. Can people vote on which chili they get, or is there just a tyrant who tells you, hey, this town only serves this combination of food items and you better like it? Or are there two parties, and do those two parties have a platform that's like, we love vanilla ice cream and red chili and you know oranges? you know vote for us.
Yeah,
Yeah, it's
exactly.
becomes very complex.
Yeah. Yeah, and so there was a big distinction there drawn between what happens when you just and so this is like the thing about these models. You start with something just like hideously oversimplified. Like obviously people's choices are not just like this one or that one. That's what we're mad about with our political system. It's like, well, we don't want this one or that one. We want actually a very discrete combination of different ones. No, and it's very frustrating. But then when you look at the tie-bout model, if it's one town, democratic referendum are great because we get to the median desire, which means most people are the most happy. But that's not how the world works, right? And so there's always one more thing that we can kind of add to the model, right? Like we start off with simple choice, only two towns, then we reduce it to one town and many choices to kind of get our heads around the model. But then the next step is, okay, now it's many towns, many choices. And then when you run the simulation on this, and I've written it out with Python as well, when you run the simulation on this, social welfare unfortunately goes down with democratic referendum as the number of towns rises and as the number of towns and choices rise as well. Like its effectiveness is bad. And the reason for that is, anybody know?
Proportional representation is like inversely related to how like democratic referenda just like shoots back down to the bottom the more towns you have. So yeah, sorry, it's just an inverse relationship. There's way too many people to represent on like every single issue, and it's really complicated.
Yeah, exactly. Proportional representation is pretty bad when the number of towns are one. But when we look at, there's a whole lot of different towns you could go to. And if we think about this in the context of, for example, the United States or Europe, if we think of those as different towns, like states or specific cities could be different towns, or metropolitan areas can be different towns. We don't necessarily have to stick to our strict definition. We can kind of call the concept of a town like a local cultural region, right? Like Atlanta is not a town, it's like 9 towns. DFW is not a town, it's like 15 towns, you know. San Francisco is not a town, it's like the 8, 9 cities around it as well, right? And so there's like, we could call those different cultural regions, but why does democratic referenda cause a problem when there's a lot of towns? What is the issue that gets raised?
I'm just speculating. Is it just because there's too much complexity for like the sorting mechanism to be effective? That's just speculation.
Yeah, it's not complexity, but democratic referenda they cause towns to freeze in place. Is the problem. They cause towns to become somewhat homogenous and not well optimized to any population's desires, right? You know, if you had policies 1 through 10, and you have some people who are pro the low numbers of policies and anti the high numbers of policies, right? Just to simplify this distribution. You have sort of the opposite, right? Where you have, you know, this is like left and right or whatever thing from whatever country, right? And so if you had those two groups, but then you have a bunch of towns that just have random yes nos on those policies, then there is no ability for us to, it's brittle. The system's brittle because there's nowhere that's very much like the preference centroid of the one group or the preference centroid of the other group, right? And in another world where the policies are sort of skewed differently, where every even numbered policy is one group likes that one, and then every odd numbered policy, the other group likes those policies, right? And they kind of hate the other policies, right? The different distribution of policies at the different towns may not reflect that set of desires and wants from the population, right? But when we have democratic referendum, we can just change it. However, the population starts off randomized, right? And so while every town will approach the median, the problem is the randomness of the scattering of people and their desires they're not incentivized to move, right? There's not enough policies here that they hate, and there's not enough policies elsewhere that they love, that they're really gonna improve their happiness by such a degree that they'll move, right? Like, you don't want to move if you're going to only improve your happiness 1%. It's kind of a big cost, right? Like, but if you're going to improve your happiness 50%, then you might move, right? But if all the towns are kind of homogenized and random, there's very little sorting that can go on. And you find things like super concentrations in 1 or 2 cities that happen to have some extreme policies. And then super low populations everywhere else where the policies are kind of vaguely homogenous. And then they freeze like that. They never really get changed because nobody's that unhappy. And so we hit on the concept of noise here, right? The democratic referendum freezes towns. So there's not enough noise in the system, not enough heat or temperature, right? To kind of shake everyone up and sort them into their right similar places, right?
After you like introduce noise into a relatively like homogenous town though, it just seems like everything just kind of settles back down on its own. I guess the author calls it through the choice mechanisms, but like, does everybody just stop like giving a care about the things that like made them angry?
I mean, kind of. Like, it's just that there aren't enough people to pass a new referendum to change it. Because the majority is okay with that referendum or that policy, and so there's not enough people to get the referendum to happen, right? Like there's some minimum threshold to get a democratic referendum to pass, or to incept the referendum. I think that's in there somewhere, like about they're good at deriving a stable platform of choices that maximize the happiness for a given town, but it just doesn't sort anybody, right? Because it doesn't. It's too cold, if that makes sense. Yeah, go ahead, Ron.
I guess I don't want to like just like jump ahead or like move out of the model system, but something that I was just thinking of is that like this model assumes that like people's desires are static and can't be manipulated, and then like things like money can't start to influence politics through advertising and lobbying, and so I guess from that just made me think that the model, that's a level of complexity the model is not including at the moment.
Yeah. So we would have to add something to the model to handle that, right? Like if we have, and this is where we really an agent-based model shines through, because in this system, when we want to go ahead and simulate this stuff, we have to have a person, and they have to have individual beliefs, right? Policy 1, I'm 10 in favor of it, but policy 2, I'm only 2 in favor of it. Policy 3, I'm very in favor. Policy 4, hate policy 4. No policy 4, right? And each individual element in the system, each agent must hold on to these desires. And then if you want to do something like simulate the effects of propaganda on an agential system, that's an excellent thing to add. So if you did something like pick 5 agents in your 2,000 agent population to give a great deal of like social influence to, and so their positions are like the positions that they're going to get to like perturb the people in their town towards, like every turn those people's positions, everybody in their town moves some percentage towards those people's positions, right? This is known as the Overton window. And it's real. It's very real. Like your actual positions will actually change when you are faced with a bunch of people who have slightly different opinions. Real.
There was kind of a simpler model it talked about at the beginning of the chapter, the standing ovation. It just made me think of that. I think that if you were to combine the two, it almost would be too complex, but I think it explains the concept. The people who are, I guess the idea is that, how many people does it take to cause a standing ovation to happen where the whole audience stands up? And the people who are at the front actually have the least information because they can't see anyone behind them, but they have the most influence because everyone can see them. And the people at the back have the most information but the least influence. And then it also mentioned that you could have shills in the audience that could influence, so there's propaganda for you, they're standing up and clapping.
Yeah.
It's actually a thing at opera.
Exactly. I think honestly the author probably does bring these things up to like bring them together, as discrete things, because the bees, they get too hot and then they decide to spread out and try to cool things down, right? And so the bee receives temperature as a signal, and over time, as T rises, we approach a point at which the bee will try to fan out and try to get cooler. Same thing for all the voting agents, right? Like they have a certain amount of happiness based off of where they're at, and if they hit a certain low threshold, they're like, I'm out of here. I'm gonna go cool off, right? I'm gonna go find myself a more well-suited town. And they can usually select from towns by looking at the town's policies and directly comparing and saying, well, what are my preferences and what are the available towns, and select the one with the most utility, which is the one with the best policy match, right? But then we can kind of we can map some of these other dynamic flows, like, for example, the standing ovation problem is good for modeling propaganda, but it's also good for modeling peer pressure, right? The standing ovation problem, like if every, like, I mean, and animals do this. What was it? There was like a time where the killer whales were like wearing fish on their heads and like, and like throwing the fish back and forth. It was like a meme in killer whale culture, right? And like so we do that too. We have memes and things that spread. And so the standing ovation problem is also the mimetic spread problem, right? And you sort of see it over and over again. So if you want to model how a meme will affect a population, right? You can have we talked about like some agents having a high degree of influence, like perturbing. But we could do another addition to the model, a gossip protocol addition, where you have an agent that believes X about policy N, and so it has a chance every like turn or tick to spread something that will perturb other agents in its, an idea, a meme of some sort, by just a little bit, right? And so you can have some agents that are meme producers, or you can have all agents be meme producers. You can kind of model this. In the real world, we see, I don't know if you have seen the pyramid effect, but on most platforms, 90% of people are lurkers who never post. 10% of people generate 90% of the content on the platform. And so if 10% of your agents are meme producers, and you just pick 10 random agents, what you'll see is that rather than having really noisy population where everyone has slightly different opinions on things, where everyone's like just a little tiny bit, like, you'll see people start to converge around centroids, these meme producing people. The meme producers will influence each other as well, right? Like, and that's sort of the other thing, is there's this feedback effect from the meme producers. So like we can actually build out this model, this timeout model, and add meme producers to it or anything like that. It's really just about adding agent interactions, And so if you've been working on the like clicker game, the main game loop, right? That's essentially the same process. You just kind of have an agent take a turn, and then like the meme producer agents would have a chance to send out a meme and things like that every tick. So this is a lot of the way that we can do social sciences now. If we want to explore certain dynamics across a population. But we've always had this concept of utility, because utility can be followed by an algorithm. The utility AI that I think people are learning about, it's an algorithm that ranks a certain number of actions based off of how much utility they have. But it's a dumb algorithm. It doesn't have any heuristics. It doesn't have any reasoning capability. And so all of the models that we've run are run on agents that are making the best, most rational choice, as in they're doing utility modeling, right? They're choosing the thing that is the most utility. But that isn't how people really act, right? Because utility is this really complicated thing. So something that we can do now with large language models is look at the nuance of something, right? We can have a large language model with given certain beliefs and knowledge of the utility, but an individualized personality. We can incept more organic human-like behavior into agents. And so there's a little bit of that stuff happening out there in the world right now. Anybody think of any good examples of that you've played with recently?
The these higher level prompt engineered, multi-agent systems talking to kind of more like symbolic or lower level systems, I think is I'm really interested in. I'm seeing work, especially in the modding scene. A lot of people taking these games like Sims or games that are really based on utility AI, and then kind of like you're saying, like giving that's the skeleton, and then like really fleshing out these characters. And I think it's really interesting where this could go. There's a lot of I think I'm especially in the modding community. I think it'll rise up towards like actual games pretty soon, but like there's a lot of cool stuff being done in that space, and I think I'm interested in to see sort of like when they did the World of Warcraft pandemic spread. I'm really excited to see similar studies done probably in the modded AI like game space, like experiments being done in that regard. I think is really, really fun.
Yeah, no, that's a great example. Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of things in the modding community as well. There's also what is it, AI Town, and what is it? I think the paper's called like Simulacrum of Human Behavior.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, I forget the actual name of it. And then Chat Dev was like the original one there. That's kind of like that. It's different than voting, but yeah.
Yeah. Well, one of the main things that kind of speaking to what you're talking about is in the simulacra paper, they actually do, I think it's generative agents, interactive simulacra of human behavior. They actually do talk about the main use case is simulating social media, right? To make it more robust against attack vectors. But then like the subscript of that, it's like the not mentioned is like, ooh, this same system is the thing that would be the attack vector. So it's an interesting kind of meta in itself. Like you're creating the complex adaptive agents on both sides.
Yeah, exactly. It's kind of an example of feedback in the system. So based on these things, in terms of decentralized sorting, anybody want to expound on some dynamics in the real world that they're seeing writ large that have been demonstrated at a small level here?
What I immediately think of is the TikTok algorithm, which is actually kind of what brought most of us here. But it does sort you based on very, very, very distinct preferences. And I think the in the terms of like Tibble, is that how you say it?
I think it's the time out.
Tibble?
It could be
Um,
out, but yeah.
I guess you could extend that by saying that you are able to form new towns. So, you can go and make a new town, um, but you have to have a certain number of people who agree with you. And suddenly that new town, the algorithm forms that town. And then you end up with, I guess, you don't have to worry about physical space because it's a digital space. So you just end up with this profusion of towns. But you want to make sure you don't end up with a town of one person because this, then you can't influence. Yeah, you'll have no influence on anyone else and can't be advertised to.
Yeah. We'll go with Liz because we haven't heard from you in a second. Then we'll do Rose.
Oh, I was just gonna say that I looked it up and it seems like it might be a Tebow model.
Thanks. Yeah, I always don't know how to pronounce things, so thanks. Ron, what were you gonna say?
I was just gonna say that I guess like on a societal level, if we're talking about like the sorting mechanism, how if there's like, we're talking about meme groups, right? So they have more influence than others. They can push, certain agendas that maybe are hostile to certain groups in the community, then those members of that community and also their friends and family, people who are fond of them, will leave. And that creates a cascade effect because now there's less people there to vote against the thing. And so more extreme measures can come forward, and then more people leave, and then more extreme measures can come forward, and then things are bad.
Yeah, I mean, a decentralized sorting in the physical world, I think it's an ideal thing. Um, I, you know, I know, like, I would prefer personally that I could go anywhere in the country and feel safe. Like, that seems like it would be important. But when you look at a population and you're thinking about, like, how do we put controls in without forcing people to live like we do? Like, we can't really force people to come live in cities. Like, that would reduce their overall happiness if they don't want to live in a city, right? We can't force people to want to do homesteading if they don't want to do homesteading, and that would reduce their overall happiness, right? There's like a lot of lifestyle things that go along with, I think, some of the like tribal dynamics that we get into. And the goal of getting people to sort into areas is so that lifestyle dynamics can be, permitted, right? And so for a lot of people who want everyone to be in a very specific way and can't handle different seeming people, it's because they have some idea about how they want to raise their kids. And, whether or not you agree with that, their happiness is very much dependent on whether or not they get to have that thing. And so, and they will cause problems in other areas where other people are who are weird. And so you kind of want them to go hang out in a bedroom community so that they can have that and not be upset at people just living their lives somewhere else, right? So it kind of works for social stability and for like permitting everyone to exist no matter what their value system is. It just does also sometimes breed extremism. And so then this is where I think things like, the direct competition works, but proportional representation, like, I think it does actually end up causing a lot more people to be happy individually about if they're sorted into the right towns, and they will be unhappy if they are not sorted into the right towns, and they should then resort. And so, like, that's sort of how the value system, I think, of thinking about this from a purely cold computational, not tied to the politics, like simulation tells us to do. And so I don't know. I mean, is it that some people are going to sort into a thing that then breeds some extremism? Probably. But it's then limited to that population of extreme viewpoints, which is usually not half the population. Is usually like a small percentage usually ends up extreme.
Yeah, I guess there would be some debate as to whether, because like there's the model where all those people are in a group so they can't hurt anyone, but then there's also lots of people get in a group and they start planning and scheming and getting better at propaganda, and so in some arguments you could say it's better that people are diffuse through the population rather than being concentrated in one area.
Yeah, exactly. It kind of depends on what it is you're wanting to control for. And so we see this in online communities, especially Reddit, the way that Reddit handles um, sorting, right? Like they don't really do moderation on Reddit anymore. They do sorting. And so they just hope that like all of the awful people are over here and all of the like people get along easily are over here, and so it's fine. Rio, what were you gonna say?
I think it's interesting that you brought up people want to raise their kids in a certain environment because that adds a level of noise because the kids might not necessarily agree or be part of the same group. So that's, I don't know if that's just, it changes the model completely because, yeah, I mean,
Exactly.
yeah, for certain things, yeah, it's, I think that the idea that the population that sorted itself can then change in a way that it didn't anticipate just over time. I
Yeah.
think adds to the complexity.
Yeah, there's a major generational element to this, and every new generation causes heat in the system, right? Because everyone needs to resort. And Liz, you were going to say something.
Oh, you and Rio hit it for me. It's nothing further to say.
Definitely. Yeah, Sarah.
I'm not sure if this is applicable. I was thinking about what's going on with California and people leaving when we were reading the chapter 2 yesterday, and I wasn't sure like how to like frame that within what we were reading. Like, is that considered resorting? Like the people are leaving, but like they're not necessarily like they're leaving for specific reasons, but they're not necessarily changing their value system or going to a place where that matches their value system. So it's like a very interesting dynamic with what's happening. So I'm like wondering how, like, do you have like a better like an explanation to like fit that?
Yeah. Anybody else want to take a swing at it before I do?
So like in the beginning, like the very first model where it was just the two towns with the two same types of chilies, and they could only decide to go to one town or the other. It doesn't matter if you swap around, but technically that system is at equilibrium. So like it thinks it's good in a certain aspect, but like in reality, there's like two people that are hanging out that can't have their favorite type of chili. But I was afraid that like the same thing would eventually happen even after you've gone through like having small towns going through like democratic referenda, reaching that point where you're like saturated with a bunch of people with a bunch of different beliefs. Like you're always still going to have some people left out, right? There aren't a number of iterations that you can go with that'll cover every type of town, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it probably is not possible to get to perfect stability, right? Because then children, like as we said, children are born and then they're not sorted correctly, and so then they need to resort. Rio, what were you gonna say?
I just put my hand down because I kind of lost my train of thought. But I thought it was interesting that you brought up California because it made me think about how they might be keeping their value systems but are moving to places that don't match up with those value systems, and it just made me wonder if there's kind of the concept of like spreading like a disease. I think they brought up like an epidemic like model, like and also it kind of made me think, are there objectively better, like is there another standard besides each agent's utility? Like I think it kind of brings in morals and ethics and all that. Like is there something above people's preference that should be applied, can be applied?
Yeah,
And from a computational standpoint, I guess it just like adds another layer to it, but I think it's pretty important for the real world if some ideas are bad and some are good.
yeah. And we can introduce value systems. But Rowan, were you gonna build off of that, or?
I was gonna ask why people are leaving California, and is it like economic related? So I don't. Sorry, I'm not.
Oh no, yeah, it brings it up. So first of all, there's the value system thing. I would say a lot of computational models, you can introduce value systems into them by saying people who value this are going to do these things. So you can either attach values to certain policies. So you just have policy 1 has value A and B. You can kind of abstract it like that. Or you can say, people that are in a culture that values community and social welfare will tend to leave towns where their relatives are often like less than people who have an individualistic viewpoint who will maximize their own utility. And then you could do another normal distribution of how individual utility valuing or how local social welfare is important to them, because that could be a different utility function. Basically, it's just like, are people in this town happy? And there are maybe agents that prefer to be in a town where more people are happy than to get their policy preferences met. So there's values there. In terms of California, it's actually an excellent example of the tie-out model kind of coming out into reality, right? California can mutate. It's how it, California's built, right? There's a lot of those democratic referenda. And so we saw this, first California went very liberal because they had an attractor policy, right, which was medical marijuana. And so everybody who was interested in that one, it's a hot button issue for people, that tended to attract people. And so we could just say policy M, and so people who had a high affinity for policy M went there. And then we had the gay marriage ban. And so people who had a high affinity for gay marriage is legal left California. There was a repulsor policy, right? So we had a tractor policy and repulsor policy sort of pushing in equal amounts, right? And then there's that's sort of how the dynamic works, right? Are there more attractor policies, or are there more repulsor policies? The Roe versus Wade thing is about construction of repulsor policies, largely. It's not actually about abortion. It is about sorting, so that people in those states will not people who moved from California to Texas because it was cheaper will now leave Texas for a place where abortion is legal. So there's a lot of different, when we think about this not from a what is correct and what are our own values, but how do these policies impact the agents and their decision making? You can kind of see these policies as attractors and repulsors to agents for sorting reasons, and it makes a lot of things really clear. It's also so that states with pro abortion ban governors can enact policies in their states to repulse people who are probably already not going to vote for them. So that's the dynamic. That's the actual utility of having done that. We'll go with Matthew and then Arrow.
Yeah, I just to add real quick on the I loved when we talked about people sitting in the front row versus the back, and it really makes me think about cultural perception and the perception of the utility of each place, being, for instance, in Hawaii, growing up there, the utility of Hawaii is where you just kick back and relax and get all the stresses of having a job out of your system, right? And so, but then that's very different from the narrative of many people here. And then there's also the concept of ability to see some places have more ability to see outside of the place, and so you're in the back in a sense. But yeah, I'd be interested in how to model that. And anyway, yeah, I also see Arrow had their hand up.
Arrow, what's up?
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna say that I think it also has a lot to do with what's happening in tech, where you have our kind of tech industry is localized in California to a pretty great extent, and then all of a sudden, all of these people in tech, and California is an expensive state, so all of these people in tech lost their jobs or were laid off over the last few years, and now they can't, even if they do agree with the policies or their lifestyle in California. California was always kind of expensive. That on top of climate change, it's a big area for fires. So yeah, that's a big reason people are leaving, which would be interesting to, I mean, just the emergence of AI has the way that it's impacting things so rapidly is pretty wild to watch in real time.
Yeah, exactly. These are all elements that are attracting, repulsing. If we think of economic pressure as manipulating the probability that you'll move to that place, it just it's a filtering out effect, Ria, what were you gonna say?
So this just kind of made me think, if we could accurately like simulate California, say, or United States politics as with as many variables as we can, as accurately as we can, maybe we could introduce, use some kind of AI model to optimize, see what would be the best way. How do we fix things? What kind of agents can we introduce, or what kind of policies would, kind of stabilize things or make things better? I don't know. I don't know if anybody's tried that.
Yeah. I think one of the hardest things to do in order to answer that question is to frame the question in a way that makes sense to enough people. So, like, when you say fix things, that's like, what does that mean, right? Like, and what does fixed mean? Like, does it mean that there's not a lot of people moving around? Does it mean like higher levels of social welfare in a general sense? And as measured by which utility functions?
I would just say decrease suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
That's
this
how
is the conversation. Yeah, sorry.
yeah, just deep. That's how I would define fix things: decrease suffering across the board.
Yeah.
As little suffering as possible.
Yeah, definitely. And it's hard. It's hard to even measure that because, I mean, of how people define suffering, right? Roan, what were you gonna say?
I was just going to say on that, like modeling front and like improving society, that like governments and people who have big models and stuff are probably already using those models to like maintain what they see as the optimum conditions, which I guess is like a stable society where everything stays the same and they keep the money they have. I think so. Those models already exist, and
Yeah.
just how money creates this like weird irrationality like in the system. So like we were saying before, like people just they'd be like, oh, I love this place, it's really great, it agrees with my politics, but have to move because of money, and it's just like puts like a massive spanner in a system that might otherwise be a lot more understandable.
Yeah. I mean, and this kind of gets into things like people are usually like, well, money, it's ruining everything, and the influence of money is ruining everything. But you can't model a system where people make choices if you don't have the concept of utility, right? And so even if we got rid of money, there would still be currency, right? It's just that the currency would shift to a different medium. It would either be how much art you make and whether or not people follow you on the internet, or whether or not you've invented enough cool things, or like, I mean, that could be, if we just got rid of money tomorrow, it would get replaced with some form of utility by which many people will orient their decision-making process. It's just that might be a different medium. And so, like, you might be able to get rid of the dollar, but you can't get rid of utility as a concept, right? And so when we have utility sinks, basically high gravity amounts of utility, they're very attractive, right? Like, the reason why you want Fort Knox to be well kept, and that's where the US keeps its gold reserve, right? And so just a bunch of gold in Fort Knox. It's a big utility sink. If you could get into Fort Knox and get all the gold, then you'd have all the gold in Fort Knox. That's a huge amount of utility, right? And so there's this attractor to try to sort of break into Fort Knox, and so they have to kind of put enough repellers on break into Fort Knox, as in like the military, and like go to jail and all of the stuff, to make it not worth going after that utility. Otherwise, it just the most next rational action, if the doors to like Fort Knox are open, is to just go in there and get some gold, right? Like, so it's kind of this mathematical, like, landscape that we have to realize, like, as agents that don't really have, like, that statistically tend to take actions agents are gonna go after the utility, right? And so you can't really not have it. Arrow, what were you gonna say?
I was gonna say Ria's question is very interesting from a sociological perspective, and I think it's it's a question that we talk about all day, but it makes me think about I think a misconception that I hear a lot is that we don't really have solutions to some of these problems. In reality, it's kind of like that the game is rigged in a way, like somebody, if you think of capitalism as a game, as somebody won the game in a way. So now we have a lot of agents without very much autonomy that we tell they have a lot of autonomy, but we have some agents with actually a lot of power and kind of are wielding in a way that sets up a system where other people actually don't have so many choices. And they do know the solutions to, like, for example, lowering suffering in certain, like these are things that are studied, but we don't listen necessarily to what's studied. I mean, the same with climate change policies and stuff. There are people studying it. We have models.
Yeah, exactly. We have these models. We kind of do know what will reduce suffering for the largest number of people. But
Not that
also,
it's that simple, but
yeah,
it's just like not the biggest problem, I think.
yeah, the problem is not that we don't know what to do. It's that it's stuff like the sorting, and it's also stuff like the utility, right? Like there's too much utility in stuff like regulatory capture. There's too much utility in, for fossil fuel companies to lobby against climate change, that if they don't do that, they lose out on the utility. It is the most rational thing for them as actors to do this. And that's the thing. It's sort of taking off the blame or the evil actions of any of these people who are making these decisions. They're not evil. They're not just like, we're the pollution gang, let's pollute the environment. It's a very cartoonish way we thought about it as kids. It's obviously not the case. It's like this person's job is to go in and say, like, hey, this if we have to do this pipeline around this lake, it's going to cost $17 billion. And then that's their job, is to say that, and try to convince them not to do it. And then, that's kind of how it goes.
Yeah, I'm
Tom.
thinking more of like when you have like multi-billionaire individual multi-billionaires who are making choices that they're not evil necessarily. Well, I don't really know, but they are self-serving agents.
Right. Yeah, all agents are gonna self-serve. And so when some agents have resources that other agents do not have, those resources will allow them to self-serve better. And so that agent will be selected for in a competitive dynamic, right? They'll be more likely to win. And so this is the game theoretical reality of capitalism is that's what happens. Ron.
I guess I just want to maybe push back a little bit on, like, I definitely things are nuanced on evil and stuff. And even though it might be someone's job to, make the pipeline go wherever, but there are lots of people that would just say, I'm not going to do that job. So there is an aspect of personal, good or evil. But I think from an actual practical perspective, it's better to look at the system. But just on like a really technical basis, I guess I'm like, they could just not do it.
Yeah, I mean, I too, I agree. Like, I don't want to work for those people, but, the reality is that is actually literally a privilege. Like, that is something that we are able to do because we have these other skills that we can leverage and employ. But if you did not have any other opportunity and it's this or be poor, and those are your choices and you don't know better, like you literally in a real sense have bought the narrative that climate change isn't real or something, then your knowledge is, well, that this is not true, and so I'm not going to engage with it as truth. If you're receiving that too many signals, the other signals can't overwhelm them, and so it's almost like a broken robot that just won't accept an update, and like.
But most of the people making these decisions have the freedom, because most of the people making the actual impactful decisions are highly educated, and they do have the freedom. They've got money, they've got savings, they've got assets. They could just not do it. So actually, they do have a lot of. I mean, the people like laying the pipeline, the manual laborers for sure, but the higher up people, I think, do have the agency to not.
They may have the freedom in an ultimate sense to do something like walk away, but in their social reality, they don't, right? Like, I don't. A lot of the things that keep our populations across these like groups stable, I mean, even on a Reddit thread, is that if you change your mind, you lose all your friends, right? If you change your mind about, you're like, actually, maybe it's better to be a Nazi. Cool, now you don't get to hang out with your Nazi friends, and you don't have any friends on the other side, and you have a giant swastika on your forehead. And so it's just like, you're not going to be welcome at the other barbecue. And so in a lot of cases, it's like, well, I don't know if I totally agree with all of these things, but Jim makes the best ribs, and like that's in many situations the thing that's happening. And then so you have these high level people. They are surrounded by other high level connected people, and those people are the reason why those other people stay wealthy, right? And so because everyone is connected to everyone else, if your whole network is like, yeah, and so we're on this side of the fence, and you're like, okay, but well, help me out, but also I might be not quite all the way on your side of the fence. Like you lose your whole network, and in wealth, you can't just like move to a new city and be like, all right, well, I'm a Democrat now, or all right, well, I'm a Republican now, and everyone just is like, oh, but you were in the other side on a different town, but okay, that's cool. Because especially as you climb to the top of the pyramid, the number of people in that group is smaller and smaller, and so those worlds are actually very tiny. They seem big, but they're, in comparison to the amount of freedom that we have to move around and just be a new person tomorrow, they do not have that freedom. So there's a lot of inertial stuff going on, I think, with a lot of those complex systems, that, like, yes, they could be courageous and do the right thing. I'm not saying that but it's less free than it seems. It's more rigid. It's cooler at the top, in terms of the noise, in that system. And so it's very hard to extricate yourself, from networks of wealth and power. Yeah. It's largely because of the graph connections, It's weird. It's weird to kind of think about it like that. But, it's really about like, why are these agents making these choices? Let's assume that they're rational and assume that they are trying to make the best choice, and then figure out what is the situation that's making it look like this is the best choice. Because they generally are just making that next calculation. Most people are. What is the next thing I can do? They're not, they're not making these crazy long plans. Even if they seem crazy long plans, like that Project 2025 thing, it's just a meme, It's just a meme from meme repeaters who are memers. Any plan is, any policy is, it's a repellent or an attractor to a region to sort. Anyway, at least under this under this model. So yeah. Well, thanks for coming, everyone. I feel like we had a great discussion, and yeah, I really appreciate your thoughts and opinions. And this is the Complex Systems Dynamics podcast at the Multiverse School.